advisor for President George W. Bush. You also served President George H.W. Bush as a special assistant for European and Soviet affairs from 1989 to 1990. So you were in that Bush White House just at the time that Soviet power collapsed. And it's been said that basically it all happened so fast at the time that nobody in the White House saw it coming until pretty much just before it went down. Is that an accurate picture of it?
Yes, more or less. We weren't able to project the crisis and what would happen day by day, not least because the leaders in Moscow weren't able to project the crisis and what would happen day by day. Václav Havel, the Czech leader at the time, said, "Things are happening so fast we do not have time to be astonished."
Which sounds like it could describe today, quite possibly. Ladies and gentlemen, Robert Blacklow. And Bob, your partner is?
Peter Hitchens, well-known columnist, author, spent a lot of time thinking about and living in Russia, and I commend to you his columns in the Sunday Mail.
Ladies and gentlemen, Peter Hitchens. Peter, I was going to do that commercial for you, but your partner just did it so well. I just want to point out you spent 2.5 years living in the Soviet Union, at the end of the Soviet Union. And rather controversially, you have written that you actually like Vladimir Putin, and at the same time you call him a sinister tyrant. So how does that work?
Oh, I think sometimes countries need sinister tyrants. And Russia is a country that needs a sinister tyrant now, having been through the dreadful debauchery and rape of the Yeltsin era, which we imposed upon it. It needs a sinister tyrant to straighten it out. And I think many, many Russians who love their country feel that way, and they've always preferred to be feared than pitied. And I think that's not an unreasonable position, and I quite understand it. I'm lucky enough to live in a country which doesn't need to be feared or pitied, but I would hate to be in a country that was pitied.
Where are you from?
Well, actually, I was born in Malta, a small island in the middle of the Mediterranean, but it was part of the British Empire then. But the British Empire has subsequently disappeared. So what I live in is Airstrip 1, a small province of the European Union.
Ladies and gentlemen, Peter Hitchens.
Formerly known as Great Britain.
And that is our motion. Russia is a marginal power. And now here to argue against this motion, I'd like to bring to the lectern Peter Hitchens. He is a columnist and reporter for the Mail on Sunday and a former resident correspondent for the Daily Express in Moscow and in Washington, D.C. Ladies and gentlemen, Peter Hitchens.
Well, good evening, or dobry večer, as they say in the Kremlin. I feel a bit underdressed for this occasion. I haven't brought my Order of the Red Banner, though I'm sure Edward will have awarded me one by the end of the evening. Edward and I hugely enjoyed the Cold War. I enjoyed it particularly as an ex-Trotskyist. I loathed the Soviet regime from that point of view, and then later on as a fervent Cold Warrior and a genuine believer in the truth that the Soviet Union was an evil empire. It was an evil empire. There's no question about it, and anybody who doubts it should have seen what I saw. But the problem with enjoying the Cold War, and if we'd like to get a party together to go and put the Berlin Wall up again tonight, I'll be the head of it, because it was in many ways extremely enjoyable for journalists and a wonderful moment in which we all knew which side we were on. The problem about enjoying the Cold War as much as we did as a pleasure is that we forget that we ought to look upon it in one or two other rather important ways. There was a very, very important moment in the early years of Mikhail Gorbachev when he was dismantling the Soviet Union, when he came under attack from a group of American conservative journalists who kept on saying, "We don't believe this. We don't believe that you're doing to the Soviet Union what we say that you are." And he just sat there smiling silkily as he did. And eventually he said, "Gentlemen, I'm terribly sorry. We have done to you the worst thing, the most unkind thing we could possibly have done to anybody. We have deprived you of an enemy." And this was what happened in 1991. We were deprived of an enemy. I was in Moscow on that lovely, sunny Monday morning in August 1991. I came out of my block of flats. My neighbors were the Brezhnev family and the Andropov family. I came out of my block of flats onto my street, Kutuzovsky Prospect, and down the street were coming tanks. In the slanting sunshine, with their barrels pointing towards the center of Moscow, rolling down, kicking up dust, a very strangely moving sight. And I saw Moscow through all the following days as that putsch collapsed utterly. And one particular scene is burned upon my memory, and that is this, that in every trash can in the city, every single trash can was full to the brim of Communist Party membership cards, burning. It was over. There was no question in my mind that it was over. This was not the Soviet Union, it was Russia. A year later, I was allowed to go into the closed city, as it then was, of Sevastopol, to see what was left of the Soviet Navy. Admiral Gorshkov's great global blue water navy, the principal instrument of power projection of the Soviet Union in its struggle for mastery of the planet with the United States. And in every creek and inlet around Sevastopol were sunken ships, ships down by the bow, ships down by the stern, ships canting over at 45 degrees, abandoned, wrecked, finished, over, dead, gone. So we have the Communist Party gone, and we have the world power gone. And then we have this extraordinary era in which, I'm afraid, Edward has been a little bit, how shall I say, kind to the West, in which we said to the Russians that we must now have in Russia democracy, and we must now have capitalism, and we indeed showered them with money and stupid advice, paying very little attention to what that country really needed, which was the rule of law and liberty. And that whole era is now known to most Russians who lived through it, when it was a time of debauched currency, hopeless, terrible corruption, misery and theft, the loss of their homes, the loss of their jobs, the wiping out of their savings overnight. They refer to it, you'll know the Russian for democracy is demokratia. They refer to it as dermokratia, which I will translate politely as the rule of excrement. That is the view of most Russians of what they went through. And I will end with another reminiscence, because this is very important in understanding why it is that Russia now so very much desires to be left alone. The other reminiscence is in my first week in Moscow, I went to a film being shown in the Cosmos cinema. And it was a film called Tak Zhit Nizya, which means approximately we can't go on living by this. It was made by a man called Stanislav Gavaryukin, who was a great friend of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And it went through in great detail, and it's a disgrace that no Western cinema and no Western TV station has ever shown this film because it's so graphic. It went through in great detail the horrible misery, corruption, oppression, and lies of the Soviet Union. And I became aware as I sat watching this that everybody in the cinema was weeping. For the first time, they had been allowed to see in detail the truth about the disastrous country in which they've been living. Now, what they want is actually to be left alone to be Russia, a country which will exist whatever you do to it. You might as well try and remove the Himalayas with a teaspoon as remove Russia from the international diplomatic or military or economic landscape. It simply is not going to go away, and to pretend that it will and to impose on it Carthaginian treaties when its territory is taken away and it's pushed up to the same borders imposed on it by Kaiser Wilhelm in 1918 is not going to work. But the thing to remember about that film is that during the last election in which Vladimir Putin won, one of his key supporters was Stanislav Gavaryukin, friend of Solzhenitsyn. And he said, I'm supporting Putin because under Yeltsin we had disgusting, hopeless misery and debauchery. Under Vladimir Putin, we have normal corruption. And that was not a feeling which was unshared by millions and millions of Russians. He spoke for them. When Putin was elected, it wasn't entirely undemocratic. I'll end with a very simple point here. Here we are in a country which has the Pacific Ocean on one side, the Atlantic Ocean on the other, Mexico at the bottom, and Canada at the top. And just imagine for a moment that you didn't have that. You had Germany on one side and China on the other and Japan breathing down their neck. And that you didn't have a gigantic global navy or an enormous amount of physical wealth, that you actually had to cope with the fact that you had dangerous neighbors. You might be less concerned with fanciful global ideas of wonderful global international cooperation, and you might be more concerned with the simple, straightforward issue of whether you could survive defensively as a country, a society, an economy, and a culture. You would be closer to the truth than you are here in this extraordinary, wonderfully protected paradise. Ladies and gentlemen, Russia is not a marginal power. Please do vote against this motion. It is a very foolish motion indeed.
Thank you, Peter Hitchens.
I don't actually share this concern about nuclear weapons very much, because I've come to the conclusion that they are more or less unusable. And I don't think anybody would, since Harry Truman used them, I don't think anybody else will ever do so. Though it is noticeable that what the Russians did develop in the first part of the 21st century.
But does that mean you're agreeing with your opponents on
well,
this?
I do. Well, I can't sit here and honestly say that what I don't believe. But I think it is simply the absurdity in this is not about nuclear weapons. The absurdity is in the wishful thinking of those who would like there not to be a major power on the planet which differs from the United States on a number of very important objectives. And the motion is really about, we wish Russia were a marginal power because we would like it to be the case that we could bomb Syria as we failed to do. We'd like it to be the case that we could globalize the world and sweep away borders to the extent they have. The argument which is not being had here about Ukraine, for instance, is probably not largely known in this country, is the nature of the European Union. The European Union is not a democratic body. It has a sort of supreme Soviet with no opposition. It is intensely bureaucratic. It is entirely lawless. It is monstrously corrupt. This is the body which we were supposedly.
What does that have to do with our motion?
It has to do with the fact that there was what has provoked the immense international crisis in which we now find ourselves is not a struggle between freedom and tyranny. It's a struggle between two power blocks. And one power block is in favor of globalism and the sweeping away of borders, and one power block is in favor of national sovereignty.
Well, Peter, in a broad way, your opponents are sort of arguing that Russia is not very good at being very good at anything.
Yeah. I'm saying it's very good at standing up for national sovereignty. The issue of Ukraine and national sovereignty is easily resolved. Ukraine is an artificial nation created at the nadir of Russia's fortunes. Had it been that the United States had gone through a tremendous crisis in 1991 in which Mexico had been able to seduce the four states which the United States took from it in 1848 back into some kind of independent republic, allowing the United States Navy use of San Diego, you'd have roughly the same circumstances, and you'd view it very much the same as the Russians.
Okay, I want to go to Edward Lucas, but I want to point out that this audience is going to vote on this motion, whether Russia is a marginal power or not.
I just think this stuff is interesting, that's all. I just would like to comment on this business of Hillary Clinton referring to Vladimir Putin as a Führer. There is this curious template in discussing foreign policy of the Second World War. And usually what it means is the person who's making the argument says, he is Hitler, you are Neville Chamberlain, and I am Winston Churchill, hear me roar. This is drivel. There are many, many other characters in foreign policy, and one of them is Woodrow Wilson, who nobody ever mentions, who created pretty much the Second World War by drawing foolish, unsustainable borders all over Europe, which have now been entirely abolished by the European Union, by the way, under the Schengen Agreement, which were, of course, the principal cause of the Second World War. And what we did to Russia was a mistake. This idea that Russia is a marginal power, which is why it is a stupid idea and why you should reject it, was put forward in the chancelleries of the West when Russia was lying flat on its back at the moment of collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, when NATO was pushed right up to the borders of Russia, something which all Russians believed they were promised would never happen. And this foolish treatment of Russia, this belief that it's a marginal power, is a mistake, and it will rebound on us. It has rebounded on us in Ukraine. It is rebounding on us in Crimea. It will rebound on us in many, many other ways. If we started treating it more sensibly as the sort of power that it is, we wouldn't have these problems.
And Peter,
it's this Führerization.
Peter, you're in a response also to your opponent Edward Lucas's description of what's motivating Putin. If you don't remember,
I think that's just childish. I mean, you can look around the world. It's amazing the bad press that Putin gets. It's entirely deserved, but it's all defenders of Israel will know this too. There's selective criticism and there's genuine criticism. If people are criticized for things which other people are doing by people who then don't criticize the other people, that's not the reason for the criticism. There is a man called Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who is in charge of Turkey, who locks up journalists in large numbers, who stages show trials for his political opponents, whose country and government is fantastically, spectacularly corrupt. He is our ally and friend, praised weekly in The Economist magazine, in which I believe Edward is a prominent figure. And never a word about this man. One of whose victims, he kills his own people. One of his victims of the Taksim Square demonstrations died yesterday as a result of having a tear gas canister fired in the side of his head. But there were many more than that. This is a disgraceful person. But not a word of criticism from the economists and the globalizers of him, because he's in favor of globalization.
Thank you very much. My name is Dr. Joshua Warwick, and my question relates to the significance of American power, especially American military power, announcements that will degrade or decrease our manpower, on the marginality or the significance of Russia. That is, as America is uplifted or degraded, what significance does that have?
Do you mean, is it a zero? Are you asking whether it's a zero-sum kind of thing?
No, not at all. But what effect will it have?
Okay, let's go to Peter Hitchens.
I don't know. I think the problem has been since the end of the Cold War that nobody really knows what the American military is for anymore. And they don't know what to design it for, what sort of wars it's supposed to fight, how to equip it, what should be spent on it. We have a similar, much smaller problem in my own country, where we have a gigantic nuclear arsenal, which defends us against enemies we don't have, who probably couldn't find us on a map anymore, because we're now so insignificant it wouldn't be worth their while bothering. So I think that one of the problems that persists in all foreign policy is trying to work out what sort of world it is. And I think the continued belief that we have a major enemy in Russia is one of the things which a lot of people in what I think has been called the military-industrial complex here rather like to cling to. And it doesn't actually tally with what's really going on, the real struggles of power, which are coming as far as I can see in the Pacific, where the United States is not particularly strong or particularly well prepared, either diplomatically or militarily, for what's coming. And it prefers to divert itself and panics about Iran, panics about North Korea, and panics about Russia. I think it's a mistake on your part. Though, of course, in 1776 you told us to keep our noses out of your business, and I probably shouldn't say any more about it.
Peter Hitchens.
Can I take issue with this word positive? It just means what Edward likes. And it isn't actually some kind of objective measure of what is good and what is bad. Quite a lot of us, for instance, think that the Arab Spring was not a wild success. Many of us think that turning Libya into a failed state with no government was not a particularly clever thing to do. And the destabilization of the Syrian regime has reduced millions of people to abject misery, which was completely unnecessary. By standing against these things, or indeed by standing against the idea of carpeting the world with useless windmills or forcing advanced countries to tax their energy industries out of existence in the environmental cause, some of us think these things are not very clever either. So to be negative about these things is not necessarily to be bad. It's rather a good thing that there is an alternative source of, how shall we say, wisdom in the world from the one which produces those brilliant ideas.
I want to remind you that we are in the question and answer section of this Intelligence Squared U.S. debate. I'm John Donvan, your moderator. We have 4 debaters, 2 teams of 2, debating this motion: Russia is a marginal power. Peter Hitchens, would you like to respond to the point just made?
Well, yes, this business about Russia overawing and overpowering other countries. Again, it's really crucial to understand that in 1918, after Ludendorff had financed Lenin and the Bolsheviks to mount a coup d'etat against the then Russian imperial government, which collapsed and surrendered in war, Germany imposed on Russia frontiers which were regarded by Russia as utterly humiliating, so humiliating that even Trotsky, one of the Bolsheviks, walked out of the Brest-Litovsk talks rather than accept them and was forced to go back in. This was the Carthaginian peace. It's interesting that exactly the same borders imposed on Russia in 1918 by the German Kaiser have now been imposed on Russia again by NATO and the European Union. They didn't last then. They won't last now. There are existential facts about countries. If, as I say, if somebody took back from the United States the countries which it captured in the War of 1848, which is a good deal more recent than the absorption of Ukraine into Russia, there would not be very long before there was a move to take them back and a strong feeling that they did not belong in whatever organization they found themselves in. This is very, very important when you don't have the Pacific Ocean, when you don't have the Atlantic Ocean, when you don't have Canada, and when you don't have Mexico. Just remember that. Russia is a country. It's not an idea. And it exists in a hard, cruel world. It's been repeatedly invaded by Tatars, Swedes, Lithuanians, Germans, the Japanese, the Chinese, anybody who happens to be
Peter,
passing.
let me stop you.
Can we please stop
Peter.
acting as if
Peter.
security is
This is the moderator
as
speaking.
readily available to Russia as it is to the United States.
Peter, land
Not true.
that thought to our motion. Why does that, therefore, fight the argument that Russia is a marginal power?
Because the whole thrust of these people is that Russia should be treated as a marginal power, be pushed to one side, have its national concerns for reasonable security overridden in the belief that it no longer counts and no longer matters. That was in the head of George Bush Sr., and it was in the head of his Secretary of State, Jim Baker, and that's what they designed, and that's what we now have, and it won't last, and the longer we believe it, the more it will hurt us.
And that is our motion. Russia is a marginal power, and here to summarize his position against the motion, Peter Hitchens, columnist and reporter for the London's Mail on Sunday.
Why do the other side so want you to believe the laughable proposition which they're struggling so hard to defend? It's quite simple, because of the way Russia understands something which we have wholly forgotten. In 1648, the nations of Europe looked at their continent, and they saw that it looked pretty much like a Hieronymus Bosch painting. Nothing but desolation, ruins, and corpses stretching for hundreds of miles in every direction. The population had actually fallen. The reason? Because they decided that it would be a really, really clever idea to intervene in other people's countries because they didn't like the way they were governed. And they resolved that they would not do that anymore. And until a few years ago, when the disgraceful person who became Prime Minister of my country, Tony Blair, became prominent, this was a generally accepted view in all countries, that we wouldn't do this anymore. We wouldn't shove our noses into other people's countries just because we didn't like the way they were run, because that led to misery, murder, and death. And Russia stands actually for the principles of 1648. It still continues to insist that countries should be left to mind their own business. Stay out of ours, we'll stay out of yours. No, wait a minute, I didn't heckle you, don't you heckle me. This is a straightforward, simple question. The reason they want to marginalize Russia is because they have forgotten one of the most important lessons ever learned by civilization. They want you to forget it too. We've seen in Syria the results of this folly. We've seen them in Libya and we've seen them in Iraq. It really is time it stopped. The attack on Russia is actually an attack on something else entirely. That's why you should oppose this very foolish, very wrong-headed, and frankly rather hopeless motion.
Thank you, Peter Hitchens. And now it's time to learn which side you feel has argued the best. We're going to ask you again to go to the keypads at your seat and vote a second time on this motion. Russia is a marginal power. If you agree with this motion after hearing the arguments, push number 1. If you disagree, push number 2. And if you became or remain undecided, push number 3. And we'll lock it out in a couple of seconds, and we'll have the results in about a minute and a half. So it's all in now. I've been given the results. Remember, the team that has moved your numbers the most after a preliminary vote and then a vote after hearing the debates will be declared our winner. Here is how it went. The motion, Russia is a marginal power, before the debate, 25% of you agreed with the motion, 43% were against, 32% were undecided. So those are the first results. Remember, you voted a second time. The winner is the team whose numbers have changed the most in percentage point terms. Here is the second vote on Russia is a marginal power. The team arguing for the motion, their second vote is 35%. From 25 to 35%, that's a 10% gain. 10% is the number to beat. The team now arguing against the motion, their first vote was 43%. Their second vote was 58%. They pulled over 15 percentage points. The team arguing against the motion that Russia is a marginal power.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.